Hey everyone, welcome to Darshan Talks. I'm your host, Darshan Kulkarni. It's my mission to help you trust the products they depend on. As you know, I'm an attorney, I'm a pharmacist, and I advise companies with FDA regulated products. So if you think about drugs, wonder about devices, or obsess over pharmacy, this is the podcast for you. I should specify I'm an attorney, but I'm not your attorney. I'm a pharmacist, but I'm not your pharmacist. So this is neither legal advice nor clinical advice. I do these live streams because they're a lot of fun, and I find myself learning something new every single time, like from our guest today. But it's always nice to know when someone's listening. So if you like what you hear, please leave a comment, please subscribe. If you actually have questions, please ask the questions. If you want to share it, we'd appreciate you sharing the document as well. If you want to reach me, you can always find me on Twitter at Darshan Talks, or just go to our website at darshantalks.com. Our podcast today, our live stream today, is going to be about engagement, and I think our guest today is a bit of an expert in that space. And we'll talk a little bit more about his expertise. And he's been a guest with us before, so I'm really excited to have him on today. I have a tight timeline with him, so I want to be respectful of that. So we're going to be asking and peppering him with questions throughout. So if you care about today's discussion, if you're in the engagement space, you probably should be listening in. I should specify that our guest for today is the executive director colleague, and as of last week, he's the executive director colleague, leadership and digital communications at Beijing, the global biotech company. Pretty sure I mispronounced that, even though I asked our guest, how do you pronounce it? But ladies and gentlemen, our guest for today, Bob Libbey. Hey, Bob.
Darshan, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
Great to be with you. Thanks for having me back.
Thanks again for coming back. So let's sort of jump into it real quick. So first of all, you started in your role. Let me start from the basics. How did you choose Beijing? First of all, Beijing. How did you choose Beijing? How did you decide that that is the role that's right for you? If I'm someone in transition, how should I or anyone else go, this is the right fit for me? And how do you make those decisions?
Well, that's a great question, Darshan, and I think it might be different or a little different for everyone. In my situation, I was actually consulting with Beijing in the same areas I'm responsible for now. And I did that for some 3 months before this became a full-time role. So I had a really good view of the company, its leadership, the colleagues in the department, in the corporate affairs department. I knew the VP of the department, having worked with her in a previous role. A great deal of respect for her, Shreya Johnny, and she's building a great function and just a terrific opportunity. So I did have that advantage of a preview, if you will, of the company and the function.
So you had some things that you already had a preview, but you're a consultant before this gig. So when you were consulting, you had several other opportunities, and we aren't going to name names or anything. But what made you go, this is the right one, as opposed to something else? You obviously knew what worked, but what have been in the past, not just necessarily in the immediate past, but in the past before, things that you knew were not a good fit for you? What should someone be looking for to say, yeah, we seem to be clashing here? And what should you be thinking about?
Well, you mean about what might not be a good fit, is that right?
Correct.
Well, I think first of all, there's the whole element of human instinct. If you don't feel a connection, you don't feel like you're getting direct responses to the questions you raise. I mean, this is obvious, but I think you've got to trust your instinct. I think also you have to assess the opportunity and how it fits with where you're at in your career, and to switch back to the positive side. In this case, this is an opportunity to really build a function in a fast-growing company, and a place where leadership values communications. I think that alignment of values is important when it comes to your professional skills. I think a larger alignment of values is important as well, and certainly that was there. But if you're not feeling that, If you don't have that sense, then I think you've got to look at the next opportunity.
Very cool. So it's funny you talk about alignment of values, you talk about the right fit. You, Bob, are actually in the role where you actually help define what a company's values are. You help sort of, and when I say define, you're putting out those messages, and you inform me that you're working on things like internet content and planning and strategy. So as you're defining this, as you're going, what are the right words to communicate? What are some initial considerations you have on how do you make that connection? How do you express to the audience what you're trying to do? Like, do you think generationally, for example? Like, I've been having some conversations with people going, I just think differently from a millennial and from a Generation Z. Or do you kind of go, no, people are people, and we can talk to them in the same way. So, love to hear some feedback there.
Yeah, I think, at the level of language, I think people are people. And I think, certain basics like, keeping it simple language, simple construction, keeping it short, which is a little bit of a nod to millennials and Gen Zers and some others, but really works for all audiences now. The importance of keeping it short has never been clearer to me with the continued rise in activity online across all platforms, including, run-of-the-mill email, which I think on average totals 120 or so pieces coming in and going out of the average worker's inbox per day. So I think those two things are very important. I think where you might see some differences is in how people prefer to receive their information, generational differences. And, that cuts in a lot of different directions. And yet there's a limit to how much you can segment in terms of delivery, because you can only run so many delivery mechanisms, right? And the other thing I would say is that, for all the importance of good, consistent, clear communication in reaching colleagues, for example, actions are just as important or more important. I mean, that old saying, actions speak louder than words. You've got to be in a place and be working, as I'm lucky to, with a leadership team that acts on the words that are spoken and delivered, because that's what people are looking for is any misalignment of that, any say-do gaps, if you will. So, and I think that applies to everyone as well, without regard to generation.
Which is really interesting, because one of the key pieces of communication, especially now, especially as I start talking to younger people, and I hate not including myself in that anymore, but I don't fit into the younger people anymore. But as I talk to younger people, they almost speak in sound bites. It's short bursts of information. I guess my question for you is, and you actually you actually emphasized that a few seconds ago. You talked about keeping it simple. You talked about keeping it short. Does that mean long form content's going away? Does that mean that the role of a soliloquy, for lack of a better term, is it's for a bygone day?
No, I don't think that's true. I think actually there's been some comeback of long form, and I think it continues to come back. I think there's a place for it. I think the pendulum swung so hard and so far to short form in the sort of soundbite approach that you just described, that there was an inevitable rebound. And, there are certain stories that you just can't tell in 100 or 200 words, or you can't capture in a tweet. That's what links are for, of course. But if you're talking about like profiling an individual with an interesting story, 700, 800, 1,000 words, 1,100 words, which I think is about the average length of a feature in the New York Times, is entirely appropriate and will be read if it's presented in an engaging way. And that includes everything from, a great engaging headline to good art, which obviously helps stop people, when they're scrolling through whatever channels they're scrolling through and you're delivering on, a great lead that really is focused and gets to the point, or somehow some other way draws people in. You can't go with a steady diet of that, but I think it really adds to the mix. And I've taught writing in a number of outlets, if you will, at the graduate level, in-house at conferences and so on. And people often raise this question about, how long should a story be? And the old response was, well, as long as it takes to tell it. Right. That doesn't really give the kind of guidance people are looking for. But, what I say when I'm asked specifically about long form, it's certainly fine to go 1,000, 11, or even 1,200 words if the story will carry it. I love this comment, by the way. Thank you. I don't have time to write you a short. Yeah. I think that he might have said, I would have written a shorter note, but I didn't have the time. I mean, yeah. It's hard to write tightly. And that's something writers and editors have to be careful of also, is that when they're, writing in long form, that they don't get loose and that they don't go on and on. As I just said, if that's what it takes to tell the story, then that's what you need to do. Is tell it in long form. You just got to make sure it carries all the way through the close.
So it's interesting. You're talking about telling the right story. You're talking about the content size. You're talking about the things that drive content. You're talking about art, headlines, the appropriate lead, and even considering the audience itself. But let me ask you this question. When you're starting to create a profile piece, do you start off by going, let me first do an SEO read on what do people want to hear about, and then let me feed that monster? Or do you go, I have an opinion, I want to put that out there, and then I'll figure out the SEO from there? How does a professional writer approach this?
Well, I think different professionals might approach it in different ways. I mean, my approach is to try to find the story behind the obvious story. Right. So, it's not just why did so-and-so join this particular company in this particular role, but what might have shaped the decision-making framework? What were the influences on that person at a younger age or in other roles, in school, who knows where, that really motivated them and set them up in a place to make that ultimate decision? The decision to join a company isn't half as interesting as the motivations behind it, in my view. So I would look at that first. And then obviously you've got to consider a lot of things, like including SEO. But I would never start with that. I mean, SEO to me is more a means. It's not an end in itself. So I guess my answer is that it's ultimately a hybrid approach, but with the story angle first, finding the story.
You're kind of forcing me into this question, Bob, but I'm going to ask this anyways. So what made Bob Libbey become Bob Libbey then? Because apparently I can't just start by asking what made you join Beijing. I need to start with what happened in the past that got you to this point. So it sounds like a good question to go there then.
Yeah, I guess I set myself up for that, Darshan. Well, I think part of what set me up for this in a very positive way is that in past roles, I've really enjoyed building things, building practices, building functions, capabilities, working together, collaborating with people to take something that isn't quite maybe where you want it. And let's be honest, in communications with technology changing the way it is, it's never really quite where we want it. So I certainly don't mean that critically, but expanding, scaling, refining, extending. That's very exciting to me. And I've had that experience and done it in conjunction with strong analytic systems that allow you to see the progress that your work is making, and that certainly this opportunity certainly ticked all of those boxes. I mean, there are others too, in terms of what the company is committed to doing in terms of making medicines more affordable and more accessible to billions more people around the world. That's a very appealing thing. And, great science and, people who really are committed to helping patients. So I guess all of those things come together, and I could just keep going back and back and peeling the onion, but A, we don't have time, and B, I'm not sure that really is engaging content itself. So
I don't know. I find you to be quite engaging, but we're gonna sort of jump into what you just mentioned a few seconds ago, which was this idea that your past was in building functions. Now, as I see it, there are multiple levels of building, right? The first level is you're collecting the bricks and going, here are the fundamental building blocks, and sort of creating that first initial structure, and then you're sort of building on top. One job is more organization, the other one is more growth. What did you sort of find yourself specializing in, or did you do both?
well, I think by necessity, I've done both, and this building piece has really been more recently in my career. And when I say recent in my career, that means the last 15 years or so. Like after I had done enough of this work in these various disciplines, communication disciplines, to have a clearer sense of where you wanted and needed to get to as a function, that obviously makes it much easier to decide how to set about building a function. And so, again, I think it's both. I think it's, the organizational piece up front, and I think it's the growth piece after that. Of course, if you don't organize it properly in the beginning, you're not going to have the potential to grow that you would otherwise. So, it is very important to get it right from the beginning, but also give yourself the room to adjust as you go, because there are a lot of nuances to this work, obviously, that depend on the industry you're in, the composition of the colleague body, the goals of the company, and so on. So again, it's always a mix. There are no black and white answers when it comes to communication. It's almost entirely on the scale of gray.
Well, the good news is that we get to learn from experts like yourself on how that gray transforms each time for each answer. I know you have a tight deadline, so I'm going to ask one last question
Sure.
before we start pulling it together. My last question to you is: you talked about how the growth is a we talked about the two different types of growth, and you talked about how each has its strengths and weaknesses. Do you think it's important to have continuity, or do you see them as two different skill sets, and therefore it's difficult to have someone work in both those skill sets because it's so different, but obviously there are advantages and disadvantages. So what have you seen? What works best, do you think?
I think what works best is doing this work with people who can do both, and I agree they are two different skill sets. But I haven't run into a corporate communications department for many years that had enough resources where you could start parsing out work at that level.
Yeah.
It's just that simple. Now, in any given team, you're going to have folks who are more or less better at certain aspects, and you make the most of those. But I think for the person leading a function and leading that kind of effort, they really do have to be able to live comfortably in both worlds.
Well, very, very cool. As you know, I usually can go for hours and hours, especially with someone like you, Bob. So thank you again for joining us. I do have 4 questions, as you know, that I'm going to ask you, and I'm going to keep them tight because I have 5 minutes to do it.
Okay.
My first question, based on what we've discussed, what would you like to ask the audience?
Well, sure. I mean, I'm always interested in what is the biggest challenge in reaching employees, and how maybe have you overcome that challenge? So that's one question.
Very cool. I try to answer that. I think my biggest challenge is, at least in the remote workforce right now, keeping them focused on what we want to do, and therefore reaching them now, not just during the work hours, but at a time that they find it convenient to be able to digest the information. I think is difficult. I'm not sure I have an answer of how you fix it, but that to me is a problem, especially with the new remote workforce. So that'd be my take. My second question: what is something you've learned in the last month?
Something I've learned in the last month, actually very recently, is the importance of accurate translation and working with expert translators. In the past, this is a function that was usually distributed among the markets because of the composition of our workforce and how we work at Beijing. You know, we're doing translation regularly, and you know, I'm certainly, God, I couldn't be more appreciative of the folks who do this work for us. But I actually was on the receiving end of it recently, where someone created something, the original document in the second language, and then they had it translated and sent to us in both languages, including English. And, you know, there are elements that needed to be tweaked.
Yeah.
And I didn't see them all in the first read. I didn't even see them all in the second read. It's not like there were so many, but my point is, it took me a good 2 or 3 reads to really appreciate what was there and what did need to be tweaked. And all of a sudden, I had a much greater appreciation for what the translators are dealing with when we're sending them things in English. So work with professional translators.
I just got Janan commenting again. Information overloads reaching employees most successful. Well, I guess she's commenting on my comment. When done in an innovative, maybe even non-digital way. That's an interesting comment.
It is.
Go non-digital.
Yeah. I agree.
So, last question for you. What's something that made you happy in the last week?
Well, something that made me happy in the last week is I actually, I had a trip planned before I accepted this role, before I knew I was going to be offered the role even, to go way up into the northern woods of Maine and go fly fishing. Incredibly remote, very dark at night, super quiet even during the day, except for the loons out in the lake, and always keeping an ear out for maybe a moose coming through the woods. You know, and I caught fish and I got to relax, and you know, it was a great place, kind of a throwback, you know, to before time, maybe even I was born, and just great to be out there and be in nature a little bit.
So Christine's commenting she loves your appreciation for translation as well. So apparently this is a continuing issue that more than a few people have faced.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you.
And Janan, thank you as well. And Bob, this was amazing having you on. I have 1 minute, so thank you again for coming on, and I hope to have you back again soon.
That'd be great, Darshan. Thank you. Always good to talk to you. Have a great day. Everyone, have a great day. Bye-bye.
Take care.